2007 through 2011 front-wheel drive Honda CR-V, both front axle replacement. I'm Brian Eslick from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps for replacing the axles. The first step is we need to get the front wheels off the ground. I'm using my hoist. If you're doing this at home, use floor jacks and jack stands and get the front of the vehicle up as high as you can, and you want the suspension hanging. Then you can go ahead and remove both front wheels. So now I'm going to remove the axle nuts. You're going to need a 36mm socket. I'm doing both left and right side. If you're just doing whatever side you're doing, you just remove that axle nut. The next step is we need to remove the ball joints, and they are held on with 3 17mm nuts and bolts. So we're going to remove the 2 nuts and 2 bolts on the lower control arm. To make quick work of that, I'm using the new Milwaukee M18 half-inch drive mid-torque impact wrench. It's great for using it on suspension work. I'm pretty much doing the whole job with this tool. I will be sure to link it up in the description of the video, along with all the other parts and tools that I use. Now we want to make sure our axle shafts here are pushing freely through the hub here. If they're not pushing in as far as you can push them in, you can screw on the old axle nut, give it a little tap with the hammer, and drive the axle inward as far as you can go. If it's stuck or frozen, you can use some penetrating oil. Now we need to put a pry bar in between the lower control arm and the ball joint here and pry it down like this, and then with one hand we're going to pull the suspension back and out of the way. So I'll demonstrate that here for you. So I'll pry it down like this, and I'll pull it like this until the ball joint is free. And you want to pull the suspension back as far as you can to clear the axle, which is only an inch or two, and then you can pull the axle shaft out like this. So if you're doing both sides like I am, you can do the opposite side now too. Go ahead and pry it down, pull it back, and pull the axle shaft out. Since I had the tools out, I like to go ahead and do them both at the same time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the suspension out of my way. I'm using a tie strap. I'm going to pull the suspension back as far as I can where I don't feel like it's damaging it. Just pull it back, and then what that does is it gives you a clear shot when you go to work on it. So it's nice. You have a nice straight shot removing and installing the axle, and the suspension's out of your way. So here you can see a better angle of what I'm actually hooking it up to. So I'm hooking it onto the caliper, on the brake caliper, and then I'm hooking the other end to my hoist here, and I'm just pulling the strap until it pulls the suspension out of my way. Now we're going to pop the axle shaft actually out of the car, and to do that we're going to need a pry bar, and you're going to go up between the subframe here and the transmission. And if you look right up in here, you can see you can put the pry bar right between the transmission and the axle shaft here, and you'll pry the axle out of the transmission. So here I am actually doing that. So I slide the pry bar up between the axle shaft like this and the transmission, and I give the axle or pry bar a little pop, a little shove on the end of it, and it pops the axle right out. Then I always match up my old parts with my new parts to make sure everything's correct. After that, we're going to install the axle back in. So we're going to slide it into the transmission. You're going to be careful not to hit that seal that's in there. So you want to line it up straight as you can get it right into the transmission. And then you want to install it straight in. Sometimes you can just push it in and it'll pop in. If it won't pop right in, what you do is make sure you hold it as stable as you can get it. Then you can put the old axle nut on the end of the axle shaft, and you'll lift the axle, line it up, and then what I do is I tap the end of it with a hammer, and it pops the axle right in. Now you can go ahead and remove your tie strap, and you can stab the axle shaft back through the hub here. So you'll just pry it back, line it up, stab it through. You may have to twist your rotor left or right to get it to go through. Then you can I like to go ahead and start the axle nut here. That way it doesn't pull the axle back out when you're lining everything up. So I just start the nut by hand. And then what you're going to do is you're going to pry the lower control arm down, and then line up the bolts on the ball joint and install them through. Before I install the bolts and nuts, I put a little bit of red thread locker on these to help prevent these from backing back out. After that, I install all of them by hand to make sure that nothing gets cross-threaded. And once I got them all started, then I'll run them in until they're snug. I'm using the impact wrench here, but I'm not using it to torque it down. I'm just running it in till the bolts are snug. Then we'll switch over to a torque wrench and torque these down. So the torque spec for these nuts and bolts are 38 foot-pounds. So go ahead and torque these down to 38 foot-pounds. You want to definitely make sure you have that red thread locker on these bolts so these bolts don't vibrate loose and come back off. I'll walk you through tightening the axle nuts up in a moment. Meanwhile, we're going to move over to the passenger side here and pop this axle out. So we need to pop it out, and to do this axle is a little bit different than the driver's side. This axle shaft on the passenger side is in two pieces. We need to pop the outer piece out. So we're going to put the tip of our pry bar on the outer portion of the axle shaft here. As you can see, I'm going at a severe angle here. And then we're going to hit the end of the pry bar with a hammer, and that's going to drive the axle out. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. So you'll line your pry bar up with the back of the axle shaft, like I said, and you'll just give the hammer or the pry bar a few little taps, and that'll drive the axle shaft out. Then you can just come around to the other side and pull the shaft out of the car. Just like we did the other side, we're going to match up our new parts. I will link these up in the description. So now we're going to take the axle shaft and put it back in. So you're going to line it up with the inboard portion of the axle shaft. And you're going to just make sure that all the grooves and stuff, you kind of twist it until you feel it go into position. And then what you're going to do is put an old axle nut on the tip of the shaft, screw it on, and then you're going to line everything up like this, and you're just going to tap the end of the axle. The most important thing is to try to get everything as straight as you can get it before you start tapping it in. If it's cocked in any way, it'll bind, it won't go in. Now we're going to make sure we got that thread locker on the bolts before we install it. I will link this up in the description also. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the tie strap and then re-stab the axle through the hub and spindle assembly. And when you install these, sometimes you can twist the axle left or right to help line everything up, or sometimes you can spin the rotor left or right to line the axle up, and then you'll drive it through. And now you can go ahead and pull the lower control arm down and line up the ball joint bolts. And just like I did the other side, I start all these bolts by hand. Then I use the impact wrench to run them up until they're snug again, not torquing them down with the impact wrench. Then I torqued all three of the bolts and nuts down with the torque wrench to 38 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to walk you through the steps of installing the axle nuts and torquing those down. So what I did was just start the bolts, and I ran them down until they're snug using the impact wrench with the 6mm socket. So I run them in until they're snug on both sides. So if you notice at the end of the axle shaft there's a notch, I'm going to show you what you need to do with that in a moment. But first what we need to do is pop out the center cap of the wheel. And once you get the center cap popped out, you can install the wheels and run the lug nuts up until they're snug. Lower the vehicle down. Now you're going to torque the axle nut down to 246 foot-pounds. So your socket will go through the hole where the center cap was, and you'll tighten this down to 246 foot-pounds. You have to put quite a bit of pressure on it to get it down to 246 foot-pounds. Now if you look at this notch on the inside of the axle, we need to bend that tab in. That helps prevent this axle nut from vibrating loose and coming back off. To do that, the best way is to take the wheel back off and then use a punch, or in my case I'm using my little pry bar, and you line that little notch up with your punch or a little pry bar like I'm using here, and then you hit the end of it and drive basically dent that little axle nut inwards into that notch. So when you're done, it's going to look like this. You'll have that axle nut will be indented like that. Now you can go ahead and reinstall the wheel and put your center cap on and torque your wheels down to 76 foot-pounds. And that'll complete the job of replacing the front axles on a 2007 through 2011 Honda CR-V. There will be links for all the parts and tools that I use in this video in the description. That way if you need to pick any of those up, you can find those there. I'm Brian Eslick from How to Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos. Encourage you to subscribe. Invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. And I'd like to thank you again for watching.